Hi, this is a short presentation from Ballyfermot Training Centre on how to prepare a CV. If you're looking for a job, the most important part of that process is preparing your CV. A good CV will ensure that you get an interview, and the interview is where you will have a chance to talk about your CV and expand on your skills. When an employer advertises a job, they may receive many CVs. As you want to make sure that they will choose your CV and invite you to an interview, it's important that you don't have any spelling or grammar errors in your CV and that your CV contains the information about you that the employer needs to know. So, first of all, we'll start with some basic do's and don'ts when preparing a CV. Now, with regard to what you do, you should keep your CV concise, usually no longer than 2 pages. An employer may receive many CVs as a response to an advertised job, and they don't want to spend hours and hours reading through lots of CVs. So, if your CV is concise and to the point, the employer will be more likely to pay attention to it. Use positive language throughout your CV. Use good action words like I achieved, I prepared, I did. Ensure you include all your achievements, both your educational and your work achievements. And check your CV for spelling, grammar, and any other errors. That, as we have already said, is very, very important. An employer could not invite you to an interview just based on the fact that you have spelling errors in your CV. So it's always a good idea when you have prepared your CV to get somebody else to read it, maybe a family member, a teacher, or an instructor, but get somebody else to read it so that they might be able to spot an error that you didn't spot, because sometimes it's harder to proofread our own work. Now, things you don't do when you're preparing a CV: never include anything that's not true. You will need to be able to back up what you say on your CV in an interview. Now, sometimes we may be tempted to put something that we may have a little bit of experience in an area where we really don't have experience in the hope of getting an interview. But really, that will get you nowhere, because if you're caught out at the interview and having said something that's not true, that's the end of you getting the job. Also, don't leave any gaps in your work history. If you did not work for a period of time, write this down and explain why. For example, you may have given up work for 2 or 3 years, maybe to mind a sick relative, an elderly relative, or to mind young children, or you may have travelled for a year, something like that. Don't just leave those years as a gap in your CV. Put down from such a year to such a year and write the reason you were not working during that time. Now, tips on preparing your CV. You may decide to start your CV with a personal statement, a few sentences outlining your achievements, skills, and strengths. Now, it's not compulsory, but some people like to include this. If you decide to include this, don't just do a general personal statement that everybody would have. Make it personal to yourself, your achievements, your skills, your strengths. The next section in your CV is personal details. You need to give your name, your address, your mobile phone number, and if you have a landline phone number, you can give it as well, and your email address. If you don't have an email address, it would be a good idea to set up an email account, because a lot of employers like to contact people by email. Then the next section in your CV is education. You should start with your most recent education course and work back. So in this section, you should include the dates you attended a course, the name of the education institute or the school where you attended the course, the name of the course you completed, brief details of what was covered in the course, the qualification you achieved. And in the next section, then you have your employment. Again, as with your education history, You always start with your most recent work experience and work back. In this section, you include the dates you worked for a company or an organization, the name and address of the employer, a list of duties and responsibilities you undertook during your employment, the reason you left. That's very important because the employer will want to know why you left your employment. And remember, as we said earlier, if there are gaps in your work history, you need to explain why these gaps are there. For example, you may have stayed at home to care for children or an elderly relative, you may have decided to reskill and take an educational course, or you may have become unemployed, but say why there are gaps there. And the next section in your CV then is interests and hobbies. Now in this section include any hobbies and interests you have. Don't include a hobby that you don't have. For example, don't say you're an avid reader if you're not, because you'll most likely be asked about your hobbies at an interview, and if you have listed a hobby you don't have, you may be cut out. And if you're a member of any professional association, you should state it here as well and explain what the association is about. And then the final section in your CV is references. You are usually required to have at least 2 referees if you're applying for a job. Now, ideally, these will be previous employers or teachers, instructors, or lecturers, and you may have had the lectures that you may have had when you attended an education course. It's very important to remember that if you're listing referees on your CV, you should ensure that you have contacted them first and ask them for their permission to include them as referees. This is very important so that the person you've nominated, first of all, will be willing to give you a reference, and secondly, will be prepared if and when a prospective employer contacts them. It gives you and the referee a much better chance of getting a good reference if they know and expect that they may be contacted. It is acceptable to state references available on request on a CV. However, if you're stating this, it's still important to contact the referees so they will be ready to give a reference to you, and you also have to have the references ready should a prospective employer look for one. It wouldn't be correct to say they're available on request and then not have them available on request. And having gone through all of that, your CV is now ready. And now that you have prepared your CV, you're ready to apply for those jobs. And very best of luck from Ballyfermot Training Centre with your job applications.